Yeah, greetings, family. I'd like to welcome you once again to the PACM or module session. This session takes place every Sunday between the hours of 6 p.m. and 8 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time. So I'm sure you're looking forward to today. Today we'll again have Elder Cecil Gutzmore with us today, and I'll put him up on the screen now. And that's Elder Cecil Gutzmore, who today will be looking at a new book just been published by Professor Prah, an eminent professor. I think he's based in Azania at the moment. And the book is entitled Karamanshini, Before and After Garvey. So Brother Cecil will be taking a close look at this book, breaking it down for us. And then, as usual, after he finishes, we will open up the floor for comments and also questions and answers. So I would like to say to all those who are new to this channel, I'd like to welcome you. And I would love you to do me a favor by liking this video, which would go a long way to help us promote this channel. So what I'll do now, I'll hand you over to Elder Cecil, and after which we will open up the floor for comments and questions. So, Elder Cecil, take it away.
My brother, thank you. I hope we have many listeners and viewers. Happy to be with the PACM TV channel as usual. You are right that I'm going to be trying to talk about a book by Professor K.K. Prah, who is a brother that I know, much more distinguished than me, and he's a brother that I deeply respect. And I want to, the book is called Karamanshini, Before and After Garvey, and then it's got a long subtitle, Marcus Garvey and His Contemporaries, the Back to Africa Movement and the Contradictions of African Nationalism Today. Cecil Prah came out in last year, the book. And I just want to say before getting into it, or as part of getting into it, just how important Professor Prah is. This is perhaps the most distinguished of our currently working African scholars in the field of the humanities, human and social sciences. He's done important work on the standardization of African languages. He ran until recently an extraordinarily important center in South Africa, which did important work and continues to do important work, including on the vexed topic of Arab-led or Arab Islamic enslavement of Africans, and many, many more topics. He is an expert on Pan-Africanism, has strong views on Pan-Africanism, argues for Africanism as opposed to continentalism, and has got into important controversies with significant other intellectuals. Now, having said that, let me go as directly as I can to the book. It's important to know that Professor Kwesi Prah was the person who called the 8th Pan-African Congress. Now, right away, there'll be those amongst our viewers who will say, how could that be true? Because the 8th Pan-African Congress is in fact still going on, didn't take place in South Africa in 2014, as was the case with the 8th Pan-African Congress called by Professor Prah, but happened more recently and is still ongoing in Ghana, having been organized by forces in Ghana and an East African country. Now, in fact, there being two 8th Pan-African Congresses raises an important problem of conflicts within Pan-Africanism, because there are forces organizing the second 8th Pan-African Congress who want to engineer and read out of the history of recent African developments the 8th Pan-African Congress that Professor Prah convened in South Africa in 2014, which, as it happens, I attended. Now, 1914 was the centenary year of Marcus Garvey's founding of his great organization, the Universal Negro Improvement Association and African Communities League. The short version of it is the right. My memory isn't working particularly well today, so let's proceed. That is the organization that he founded in 2014, in 1914 rather, and I went to the 8th Pan-African Congress, convened, as I say, by Professor Prah, and I was more than a little bit disappointed about the very small, almost invisible place that Garvey had in those proceedings. I didn't raise it with Professor Prah beforehand, but what I then proceeded to do was to invite him to deliver a lecture in London, one of the annual Marcus Garvey Memorial Lectures that have in the past been held at Birkbeck, University of London, which is a university that Marcus Garvey attended while he was in the UK between 1912 and 1914. Professor Prah did come and deliver that lecture, and then he went back with the draft and worked further on it. And this book, this 2019 book, is the outcome of his researches into Garvey and his presentation of his view on the Honorable Marcus Messiah Garvey. Now, it matters that Professor Prah says on page 2 of the book that my limited objective has been to draw some conclusions regarding Garvey's ideas and to address the implications of his life and work with respect to current issues of immediate relevance around Pan-Africanism and African development. So that is his declared objective. Given who Professor Prah is, given that he knows Marxism and Pan-Africanism, my hope was that he would turn that wonderful scholarly apparatus which he has readily at his disposal into an electrifying exposition of Marcus Garvey coming from continental Africa. I'm a little bit concerned about what he has in fact given us, and that's what I want to talk about. But in talking about that, it seemed to me that it is necessary to understand what is already out there about Marcus Garvey and how important it was and is to start properly from the constituted field of study around Marcus Garvey. So I'm sitting in my own library, my study, and behind me are 13 volumes of the title Marcus Garvey and the Universal Negro Improvement Association Papers. The editor of the publication is Robert A. Hill, a Jamaican scholar, tremendous scholar. I have problems with his Garveyism, but I have no problem with his scholarship, a tremendous scholar. And he is editing this set of books, which is incomplete at the moment. You can see the size of them. There are already 13, at least, of them available. And without being rich, they cost about £100 each. And without being rich, I've managed to get hold of 12 of the 13, and proudly. So the Hill volumes represent one foundation, but it's a problematic foundation, not in respect of the scholarship, but in respect of the politics that Professor Hill brings to the issue of how Garvey is to be studied, understood, remembered, commemorated, built upon. So Robert Hill is there. And Hill, in addition to the volumes that he's putting out that I've just mentioned, is also the collector and editor of a publication by Marcus Garvey, which was done, the first issue appeared in Jamaica, and then Garvey was in the UK again between 1935 and 1940 when he died here. And he put out a journal, beg your pardon, called The Black Man. And so we have that. And it's an important document and starting point for the study of Garvey. And then there is an important, extremely important, now passed on scholar on Garvey, a Garveyite, the late Professor Tony Martin. And his, I'm going to call it a masterpiece on Garvey, is called Race First, and represents an important point of departure, one of them, another of them. And then you have the Jamaican scholar, a bit in a way like Professor Prah, somebody who's very well schooled in Marxism and combines that with being a serious African nationalist. Professor Rupert Charles Lewis, now Professor Emeritus of the University of the West Indies at Mona in Jamaica, where I taught for a while. And his book is called Marcus Garvey, Anti-Colonial Champion. And what Professor Lewis does is to focus on Garvey's time and years in Jamaica. He was an African Jamaican, born there in 1887, and crucial years of his working life were spent there. Other crucial years were spent outside. And what Rupert Lewis does is to focus on his work as an African Jamaican within Jamaica. So another serious point of departure. And then, because Marcus Garvey married two remarkable women, both of them called Amy, an important point of departure is represented by Tony Martin's work on the first Mrs. Garvey, Amy Ashwood Garvey, and Tony Martin's scholarly biography of Amy Ashwood Garvey is called Amy Ashwood Garvey by Tony Martin. It's subtitled Pan-Africanist Feminist Mrs. Marcus Garvey #1, or A Tale of Two Amys. So that is available. And the second Mrs. Garvey is also well documented. She is Amy Jakes Garvey, and there's an important biography of hers here. It's by Ula Yvette Taylor, called The Veiled Garvey, The Life and Times of Amy Jakes Garvey, and that's available too, an important starting point. The women in Garvey's life were and are extremely important. And then Amy Jakes Garvey wrote a book on Garvey called Garvey and Garveyism. important point of departure. And she is the person who edited 3 volumes of The Philosophy and Opinion of Marcus Garvey. This is just one version of the many published versions of Philosophy and Opinion. There are, in fact, 3 volumes of it, 2 that she put through the press in 1923 and 1925, and a third one that came out a decade or 2 ago, maybe slightly more than that, which she edited along with a continental African professor. And behind me on that shelf are many other books on Garvey. So Professor Prah wasn't starting from nowhere. And an important question for me in approaching his book is, where does Professor Prah start in exploring this very important figure, Marcus Garvey? He has a preface in the book. He has an introduction, and the introduction is relatively long. It runs from page 6 to page 24. And the scene setting is done after the introduction, which is itself a very important scene setting, because it makes an argument, a set of arguments indeed, about and against and around Marcus Garvey that's difficult to get out of your head as you get into the rest of the material. So what happens in the opening part of a book really does matter. It's fundamentally influential. Prof. Prah goes on after scene setting to talk about 2 options, to talk about the Back to Africa record, Garvey and his time, the New Negro and the Harlem Renaissance, the record and semantics and biography and culture of contemporary Pan-African contacts, and he also offers some appendices. Now, my difficulty with the book begins in the introduction, because what Professor Prah does there is not start us off from even Hill or Tony Martin or Professor Lewis or Amy Jakes Garvey. He sets up an image of Marcus Garvey as having failed around the Black Star Line and his vision of Back to Africa. Now, it seems to me problematic to frame Garvey in this particular manner, almost wholly in terms of Back to Africa. And even if you do that, it's difficult to argue that having set up with all of the difficulties, and there are real difficulties, and Professor Prah doesn't shy away from them, and nor do others, it's important to know that Garvey had a second shipping line, and it's important to know that Garvey also had a Back to Africa project in relation to African settlement in Liberia. But even if we put that aside, I have difficulty dealing with an intro which locates Garvey in terms of the criticisms of his main enemies. And so W.E.B. Du Bois, what was Garvey's relationship with him? Garvey founded the UNIA in Jamaica, as we've already said, in 1914. He, after struggling with it in Jamaica for 2 years, he decided to go to the United States of America, primarily for fundraising, but also to meet and attempt to deal with two then very important Africans. One of them was W.E.B. Du Bois, and the other one was Booker T. Washington. By the time Garvey got to the United States of America, Booker T had just died. He was in fact received by Booker T's successor, but he also sought and repeatedly sought conference with W.E.B. Du Bois, which he never got. What is more, he offered, because of the importance of W.E.B. Du Bois's role within African America, he invited him into his organization and offered him a leading role within it, which was also spurned. Now, Du Bois wrote 2 longish articles on Garvey. They are sharply critical, but they are also, at another level, not unreasonable assessments. And how those assessments are used in any critical intro to Marcus Garvey matters. The balance that is built into W.E.B. Du Bois's 2 critical essays, if you will, on Garvey need to be reflected in any attempt to use Du Bois as part of an intro to Garvey. And that is not, in my view, quite managed by Professor Prah. But there is something else that's also, and perhaps even more worrying, and it's to do with how other enemies of Garvey are mobilized. Prof. Prah has 2 references to a brother called Paul Gilroy in his book. At one of the points where Gilroy is used, Prof. Prah is quoting Gilroy, quoting Garvey. The article from which, the Gilroy article, is entitled Black Fascism. And the purpose of the Gilroy article is to locate Marcus Garvey as a black fascist, which is an extraordinary and dangerous and actually inaccurate thing to do. And at this point, it becomes a little bit tricky because Gilroy is quoting Garvey, referring to himself as a fascist. What Garvey actually says is that Hitler and Mussolini learned fascism from him. And what can Garvey have meant? And why in heaven's name? I mean, I know why Gilroy does it, because Gilroy is an anti-black intellectual. But why would Professor Prah use Gilroy quoting Garvey without spending some time dismantling the Garvey quotation? What Garvey actually says and means is that his methods of popular organization, the use of powerful symbolism in bringing people together behind a leader, represents something that both Hitler and Mussolini learned from him. And if that is what he meant, it is true. But that doesn't mean that Garvey belongs amongst fascists, because that is all he means. He's talking about symbolism and methods of popular organization. And fascism, strictly understood, cannot be separated from racist ideology, one, and more specifically, what fascism is the active and systematic mobilization of working class forces, forces at the bottom of a capitalist society largely, but not necessarily a capitalist society, mobilizing against them in their own interest and on behalf of the ruling circle. That's of the essence of fascism. Also of relevance to European fascism, certainly, is egregious racism, which led to putting Jews in gas chambers and Africans in gas chambers and gypsies in gas chambers in very large numbers indeed. There is talk of in excess of 6 million. Now, if you have that understanding of what fascism is, you would know at once that even though Garvey says that Hitler and Mussolini learned fascism from him, that does not represent a basis for putting Marcus Garvey into a camp under a heading entitled Black Fascists, which is what Paul Gilroy, who is seriously, systematically anti-Black, is doing in this article of his that Prof. Prah quotes from. And it seems to me that Prof. Prah, in allowing himself to fall into this error, is doing himself and Garvey a serious, very serious disservice. And much of the intro, the introductory part of his book, is not so blatantly by any means, but really quite blatantly a critique of Garvey, from which the rest of the account, of his account of Garvey, has very great difficulty recovery. And so let me say now what I hope that Professor Prah in this book would have done. I had hoped that he would have started from the Hill work, which is available, and that he would have discovered that the essence of Garvey isn't back to Africa, although he was strong on going back to Africa and really believed that us uniting together, organizing to go and rescue Africa from colonialism alongside continental Africans was the principal task of African people on the planet. So he wasn't wrong, Marcus Garvey, to focus on back to Africa as part of a program of African people organizing via a revolutionary process to rescue ourselves from the condition that we were in Garvey's time and that we remain in. So I hoped that Professor Prah would have looked at Hill Volume 1 for a start and have seen in the pages of that book the scope of Garvey's organizational and ideological intention, not in 1919, when we have the first full constitution of the UNIA, the Universal Negro Improvement Association, but in 1914, when he founded it, and in respect of which we have fragments which are reproduced by Hill in the 50s pages of his gigantic volume 1. There it would have been clear that Garvey intended a universal African organization of African people worldwide, that he wanted a liberated Africa, that he wanted a unified Africa, that he wanted Africans who understood the basis on which we needed to be and are entitled to be proud of ourselves as a race, and so on. And not to have started there, not to have started from that acknowledgement and realization, leaves us in an extraordinary position. Now, that Marcus Garvey, the Garvey of 1914, needs to be perceived and should have been perceived by Professor Prah as the revolutionary Pan-Africanist that he was. Not because he had Marxism built into his program, but because he was for and seeking to inspire a revolution that was directed at getting colonialism and colonialists out of continental Africa. Now, that is a revolutionary program. And Garvey, from 1914 onwards, right up until the time that he died in London in 1940, was a revolutionary Pan-Africanist who was actually ahead of almost all other Pan-Africanists who tended to be gradualists in their orientation towards Pan-Africanism. Garvey was putting out popular newspapers from before 1920 and putting out cartoons and other material directed specifically at telling the masses of Africans in Africa and outside of Africa that Europeans had put down, if you will, nothing in Africa, that all they had ever done and were doing and are now doing in greater quantum than ever was rip off, steal, exploit Africans and continental Africa. Now, Professor Prah needed to take account of that and to present Garvey as a revolutionary Pan-Africanist. Now, a person who is a Marxist may very well have difficulty with that, because Marcus Garvey, in some readings, appears, not by any means inaccurately, as anti-Marxist. And then, in order to deal with that, it is necessary to understand what Garvey's attitude really was to communism, and especially to Leninism. Any proper reading of the Hill volumes will make it clear that in and around the period of the First World War, Garvey welcomed two revolutionary developments in Europe. One was the Irish Easter Uprising, which was defeated by the British, colonial occupiers and mass murderers in Ireland of Irish people. A failed, at the time anyway, drive against the British. Actually, it didn't really fail. Within less than 10 years of 1916, a big part of Ireland was a free and independent republic, with the rest of Ireland only remaining under British control because the British, who had planted Scottish Protestants in part of the north of Ireland manipulated the boundary there of a province that had 6 counties called Ulster. And in order to keep a British toehold there, they cut off 3 of the counties of Ulster, allowed them to go into the Republic so that there could be a Protestant majority, an artificial Protestant majority in the remaining 6 counties. Garvey, in respect of Ireland, was a revolutionary Pan-Africanist, a revolutionary Pan-African appreciator of armed struggle against British colonial imperialism. The second event in Europe that Marcus Garvey welcomed was the Russian Revolution led by Lenin. I once remember a student, I said that to a student, and he called me wicked for saying that Garvey had welcomed the Russian Revolution. But the Hill volumes make this clear. Garvey saw the liberation of the white working class, or the start of that, as what Lenin had achieved in what became the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. And he was in favor of it. And what he then wanted was for us Africans to carry out an equivalent of that, in which we liberated ourselves from exactly those forces that Lenin had managed to liberate the Russian peasant and workers from. Garvey was a revolutionary Pan-Africanist. Garvey was saying, from 1914, liberate and unite Africa now. Now, what I had hoped was that Professor Prah would have spent more time than he actually does on Garvey's actual international conferences of the Negro African people of the world, 8 of which he organized, and 8 of which were generally more internationally African and therefore more genuinely Pan-African than all of the Pan-African congresses that are officially in the record, that take us up to perhaps 5, although it's possible to count that differently, in 1945. Now, so what we have in 1945, and I think it would have been important for Professor Prah to recognize and say this, was that Pan-Africanism in the 1945 Congress, which abandoned Pan-African gradualism and adopted the stance on colonialism that was inherent and imminent in Garvey's approach. White power, white terrorism, colonialism must leave Africa now, not in 200 years' time, not in 100 years' time, not after they had civilized and educated us, as they were fond of saying, and as some Black people tended to accept and believe, but now, because Africa was ours and we needed to stay there, to go back there, and to organize it for the purpose of African autonomy, African self-development, African liberation, African unification, and to give ourselves the power to take from the continuing oppressors what they have taken from us. Call it reparation, call it restitution, call it what you will, but that which cannot happen unless we Africans empower ourselves via the process of the African, Pan-African revolutionary achievement, which is what Garvey was in favor of. Now, we have a Garveyite, and this is important, a Garveyite 1945 Fifth Pan-African Congress. And we have a process thereafter which is Garveyite in essence, which is revolutionary Pan-Africanist in essence. It is about the unification and liberation of continental Africa. Key leaders, or a key leader within that process, is none other than Kwame Nkrumah. And Kwame Nkrumah leaves no doubt, it is there in his autobiography, that he was a Garveyite, influenced by Marcus Garvey, by his 1920s philosophy and opinion, but influenced also, this is Kwame Nkrumah, by the writings of Marx, Lenin, and Engels, and he says so. Kwame Nkrumah says so in his autobiographical writings. And Nkrumah combines or develops further Garveyite revolutionary Pan-Africanism. Now, in the period after the Fifth Pan-African Congress, Africans move towards independence. And it would have been extremely important for Professor Prah to have identified in his book that the Africans who moved for independence faced a challenge, the challenge of white power, the challenge of colonialism, the challenge of imperialism, the challenge of capitalism. That was the challenge they faced. And it was necessary for them to approach that matter correctly. And the key Africans who approach that matter correctly are people like Kwame Nkrumah, who is a Garveyite, a revolutionary Pan-Africanist, with his nationalism, his African nationalism, his Pan-Africanism, infused by understandings of the world generated out of Marxism. People like Walter Rodney, who are of the same ilk. People like Amilcar Cabral, who are of the same ilk. People in a way like Frantz Fanon, who are of the same ilk. Now, so there can be no compromise with colonialism, and colonialism might present in such a way that in order to get African freedom, they have to be militarily fought. And that is exactly what happened in Africa. Now, two things in effect happened in Africa, or one thing in two parts. The liberation process, so-called, which was a combination of retreat and defeat of white supremacy, of white terrorism, of colonialism. Now, the whites, the colonialists, pretended to be vacating Africa. And a British Prime Minister talked about a wind of change blowing through Africa. They had already set up in the parts of Africa that they were ready to surrender to leaders who were doing their bidding. They already had a majority in Africa of such leaders. So Kwame Nkrumah was in a minority amongst African leaders. So revolutionary Pan-Africanism was the minority position within continental Africa in the period after the Second World War, in the period after the Fifth Pan-African Congress. And that remains the case. So Europe granted flag independence. Professor Prah is clear about that. Europe said that in places where we have large strategic interest, where we have large economic interest, where we have large numbers of settlers, we want to try to hold on to those places. In order to do that, countries like Britain and France had to use methods that bring them right back into the camp of the Hitlerian fascists. In Algeria, there is no distinction between France's treatment of Algerians and Hitler's treatment of Jews or blacks or gypsies in Germany, or of Hitler's predecessors' treatment of Africans in Namibia in the early part of the 20th century. None whatsoever. In Kenya, the British went back to concentration camps. And this is within less than 10 years of the moment when they hanged Germans for using concentration camps against Jews. But it was apparently okay to use them against Africans. And indeed, it was the British who had invented concentration camps in the first place in Southern Africa. Now, and in Southern Africa, Namibia, South Africa, the Portuguese territories, Zimbabwe, settler colonies, strategic places possessing vast quantities of Africa's riches, whites tried to hold on to those places. Those two things, those two features of Europe's defeat in Africa have to be at the core of revolutionary Pan-Africanist analysis. And I don't quite find that in Professor Prah's Garvey book in exactly the way that I didn't find it in his 8th Pan-African Congress. Now, why is that so? It is an important truth that whether freedom from colonialism was won by peaceful means or by armed struggle, almost without exception, perhaps without exception, African countries and countries with African majority populations in the Caribbean, say, have ended up as neocolonies. And the Garveyite revolutionary Pan-Africanist Kwame Nkrumah pointed out that neocolonialism is simply the last stage of colonial imperialism. So, the crucial issue for revolutionary Pan-Africanists is how can African unification and liberation and then reparations be won in the face of an enemy that is now defined as the neocolonial form of white domination, of white terrorism, of white-run, white-led capitalism, imperialism, that system, which is exactly the system that organized our ancestral enslavement which is exactly the system that organized the colonization of our continental homeland, on of the territories from which we came, through which we came in the Caribbean, and that colonized the whole of the world, that system, and which did so with astronomical, unspeakable, murderous brutality. Now, revolutionary Pan-Africanism has to face into that. A key, and I'm going to probably end soon, a key characteristic of Professor Prah's approach to continental Africa, and it's entirely reputable, is his division of Africa, or his acknowledgement of a division within Africa between what he calls the Arab North and the rest of Africa, Africa proper almost. I have difficulty with that, and I have those difficulties despite my massive respect for Professor Prah and despite seeing the importance of what is happening. What is happening there, amongst the things that are happening, is one, that North Africa is said to be Arab. North Africa and a lot of North Africans are oriented not primarily towards their geographical location in Africa, but towards their cultural and political orientation towards Pan-Arabia, towards the Arab world, which they want to unite in a kind of Pan-Africanism, Pan-Arabism. That is important. Also important is the fact, and it's a massively important fact, that the people who dominate that part of what Professor Prah calls Arab North Africa organized against us, let us call ourselves for these purposes Black Africans, a process of enslaving our ancestors that ran for longer by half a millennium than the European process of enslavement, which is called Atlantic enslavement, Atlantic slavery, the Atlantic slave trade and enslavement. Longer. And almost certainly extracted more people from Africa south of the Sahara into Africa north of the Sahara, into Arabia and into lands beyond. Almost certainly extracted more than did the Europeans. Now, it matters that the majority of those extracted by Arab Islam were women, because that impacts the appearance of their descendants. I heard a distinguished Muslim scholar deny the fact of Arab Islamic, what Professor calls Arab-led slavery. Because he said, if it happened, where are the descendants of those who were extracted into Northern Africa? He says, you can see them, their equivalent, over on the American side of the Atlantic. Where are they in North Africa? That scholar was able to say that because he didn't recognize the overwhelming majority of women in the population extracted, and he also didn't realize the extent to which males extracted into that process were forcibly castrated. So we have a North Africa which is culturally Arab, but which in fact, and I was looking at some figures recently, which in fact is just as African as the Caribbean, just as African as Jamaica, perhaps a little bit less so. These are people who have been Arabized and Islamized. And that is the challenge that Africans face, are we going to be able to deal with the Arabization and the Islamization of that large proportion of Africans living in the northern part of Africa, calling themselves Arab, even though most of them don't look particularly like yours and my conventional view, stereotype of what the Arab looks like. And it matters that going back into the 15th century, thereabout, Europeans recognized that there are two types of Arabs, Moors they called them. They saw tawny Moors, which is light-skinned or white Moors, Arabs, and blacker Moors, which is how they saw the rest of them, including people that look like me, and probably most of those who were observing or viewing this. So I am not in favor of, and it's in Professor Prah's book, even though he doesn't say it in these terms, of abandoning to something called Arab North Africa, that part of Africa, and concentrating only on recovering ourselves below what he calls the borderlands, the African Arab borderlands. All of Africa is African, and the challenge is for revolutionary Pan-Africanists to find the way to make that continent into a liberated zone of African consciousness, African peoplehood, African culture, and to make that into a liberated zone where our resources don't flow out to other people, and where the white people of the world, capitalism, imperialism, white power, white supremacy, white terrorism, don't find people who look like me to run the overwhelming majority of the parts of Africa, the states in Africa, on their behalf, and increasingly, or while increasingly, providing people who look like me with the means to kill at a whim the mass of African people who look like me, either directly or indirectly, as, for example, happened in South Africa in 2012 at the notorious Marikana massacre, when approaching 100 people, African miners, striking for a living wage, had guns, including submachine guns, turned on them by the ANC, which was one government, which was once a national liberation movement. Now, in that same territory, that same ANC government, neocolonial government, it has agreements with an Australian mining company, which is busy trying to extort and extract precious materials from sands in a part of the South African coast called Zalobeni. The majority of people who live there don't want that. So there's a sub-neocolonialism happening in that place where the South African government, the ANC, is helping the Australian white races to find forces within that community who will be willing to kill and to use any means necessary in order to enable the Australian company to do what it wishes. Now, that is not just happening in South Africa, and that is not all that's happening in South Africa. There's a movement there, which is the squatters movement. The ANC, in its municipal existence, is busy repeatedly brutalizing and killing some of the people within that movement. And that, I repeat, is not uncharacteristic of what is happening elsewhere in Africa. So a book on Marcus Garvey really would and should have to deal with these crucial issues of how revolutionary Pan-Africanism liberates and unifies Africa. Now, Professor Prah has stuff in his book about the essential requirement of African unity, but it's not put in a sufficiently clear, sufficiently Garveyite, sufficiently revolutionary Pan-Africanist approach to these issues. Neocolonialism is not foregrounded in the book in exactly the way that it wasn't foregrounded in the 8th Pan-African Congress. And so I'm almost hoping that Professor Prah will do a very quick second edition of his book and will actually capture in a more complete and more effective way than he has done in this first edition of it, the Marcus Garvey, who many of us love, revere, believe to be massively important, and know that his program for the unification and liberation of Africa is incomplete, is presently stuck in the sands, and the sinking sands of neocolonialism, and that we Africans have got to find a way to extract ourselves from that. And that Garvey, who was a race and class man, that Garvey, who understood the need for us to love each other as Africans and to work together as Africans, who understood that there were present in us and amongst us a section of our community who are traitors, who do not deliver, who primarily deliver to the enemy. Garvey knew about those, and those are the forces, along with their masters, who now stand in the pathway of African liberation. And I'm still looking forward for a version of Prah's Garvey, which presents that Marcus Garvey, and not the one that inhabits the pages of Crow-Mancini before and after Garvey, Marcus Garvey and his contemporaries, the Back to Africa movement, and the contradiction of African nationalism today. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Elder Cecil. Yeah, so this is a time for any questions or comments. Please feel welcome to just forward them to us here, because we like these sessions to be very interactive. Now there's I'll put up a few comments that's come through, and then I'll just take them in order as they come. So first, there's one here, and it said FDR, suppose that's Franklin Roosevelt, also copied fascism from Garvey. That's just a comment. It'd be nice to hear your comment on that. And this brother has also some other comments, so I'll just go with that one first.
Okay. I believe that we mislead ourselves if we pursue that particular Garvey comment, right? Because fascism doesn't mean what Roosevelt did, and it also doesn't mean what Garvey did. In the 20th century, the model and the reality of fascism is what Adolf Hitler and Mussolini did in Italy and Germany, respectively, and in places that they invaded or conquered, including, for where Italy is concerned, Libya and also Ethiopia. Now, nothing in what Garvey did in thought or word or deed resembles any of that stuff. Now, the brother is right that there may be something to recognize of Garvey's popular mobilization in Franklin Delano Roosevelt's popular mobilization. I doubt that we'd find very many similarities, but I'm prepared to concede that some may it may be possible to locate them. The other thing that might be important there and that the person might have in mind is the extent to which Hitler and Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the New Deal and in the reconstruction of German industry were directions perhaps in which it's just conceivable that Garvey was pointing. Certainly he had notions about the importance of collective economic organization and the role that that could play in collective racial liberation. But this is not fascism as properly understood.
Okay. And next, the same brother, was it Kofi Campbell? He said Garvey was no Bolshevik. I know you said you admired Lenin.
No, I think I know. I think I know. I think I know, brother Kofi, and I'm glad to have him on. He's a student associate of mine at the University of the West Indies. It's very important to say that I am not saying that Marcus Garvey was a Bolshevik. He never says that he is, and he fights Bolsheviks who try to take over his organization and ends up looking anti-communist. But in point of fact, if you go to volume 1 and volume 2 of the Hill volumes, you will find that Garvey welcomes Lenin's Great October Revolution, and he welcomes it because he says, in his words, that he is in favor of the liberation of the white proletariat, which is what Lenin is doing. And he, Garvey, wants to liberate black people in exactly that way from the same forces. That doesn't make him a Bolshevik, and I'm not saying that he was a Bolshevik. I am saying, though, that he was a revolutionary, but a Pan-Africanist revolutionary.
Okay. And finally, there's one more question again from Kofi. And he's saying here, Marxism and Keynesianism, central planning failed Africa. Because we know after so-called independence, a lot of African leaders leaded under Marxist model, only to have it fail them drastically. So what do you say?
No, you don't mean the market model, you mean the central planning. Again, it's exactly the kind of question that I would expect from my friend, actually. I know him quite well, to ask. I'm not advocating central planning, and I'm not saying that Garvey advocated central planning either. But Africa does need a unified state. It needs, if it had such a state, in exactly the way that, for example, China, which had a long revolution in the 20th century and ended up a self-liberated place, able to deal on equal terms with the rest of the world, because it's one country and it made itself one country via a revolutionary process. And to the extent that we Africans didn't manage that over the same period, we've left ourselves extremely seriously exposed. Now, Garvey and Garveyite Pan-Africanists like Nkrumah saw that and advocated it and did everything in their power to try to bring it about. It was undermined because already in Africa, when the Organization of African Unity was being formed, there was a majority of African so-called leaders who were committed to what the West was telling them they needed to do, which is to institute on the African continent the model of Africa that the Europeans had decided on in 1884 in Berlin, at the Congress of Berlin. Now, you, my brother, host, are the person who helped me to understand from a lecture that you showed me by another brother about what really happened in 1963 at Addis Ababa. And acknowledging you and thanking you for bringing this to my attention. The truth of the matter of what happened in 1963 is this. Kwame Nkrumah found that there was a majority against the Garveyite Nkrumahist model of how Africa should organize itself. He was walking out of the conference defeated. His Imperial Majesty Haile Selassie, who was hosting the conference, went out and brought him back in. And Nkrumah came and sat there. There's this massive majority against him, nothing that he could do. And then something extraordinary happened. And I'm thanking Brother Taharkah again for bringing this thing to my attention. What happened was that the head of the Algerian delegation got up and said, my African brothers, what we're doing is putting the cart before the horse. How can we be discussing African unity and institutionalizing it before Africa is liberated? And if we look at Africa, we can clearly see that all of these countries where we're conducting armed struggle or about to start conducting armed struggle are not yet liberated. So we don't have an Africa to unify. Let us pool our resources, liberate Africa, and then talk about this, the form of a united Africa. And the Algerians said further, we Algerians have just defeated France. We have military experience, and we Algerians are prepared to put 10,000 seasoned troops into the battle to liberate Southern Africa. Didn't happen. But what the effect that did have was that everybody who was at the conference, including Kwame Nkrumah, got up and said, yeah, and signed up on the basis of the promise to have a liberated, unified Africa, on the basis of the promise from the Algerians that they were coming to help. They didn't come, and the only people from outside of Africa or from anywhere north of the Sahara that put any forces into Africa liberation were the Cubans. And it's important that we manage that. Remember that Cuba is a Latin African society, that the majority of people there are in fact African. And that big African country that had already liberated itself from African Caribbean country, that already liberated itself from white power, certainly from American white power. Some nationalists argue that they're still under white power because Castro is a white man. We can argue that on another occasion. I might do a session on Cuba. But importantly, Cuba was the non-African continental country that put troops into the liberation process of Africa, and it worked. Yeah. So I repeat, I'm not advocating central planning, although central planning in a unified Africa may have a place. Kofi is correct. Central planning has been shown to have very serious limitations, certainly under the conditions that existed in the former Soviet Union. It's not proving so inadequate in Cuba or China. And even in those places, central planning might be on the wane. The other thing that anybody who is interested in revolutionary developments needs to recognize is that capitalism has unjustifiably captured markets as a distributive mechanism. There is nothing necessarily capitalist about markets. And me, as somebody who is interested in Marxism and socialism, wants it to be clearly understood that socialism can and should use markets as a distributive mechanism, because there is nothing necessarily capitalist about markets.
Okay. So yes, so you gave a good rundown on Marxism, why it's not appropriate for Africa. So what about Keynes?
No,
He talked
Keynes
about,
is right. What Keynes did was to say that the bourgeois state, the capitalist state, could actually be used as a tool of economic development, and that's what we saw in the US in the 1930s, and that's what we saw in much of Europe in the post-war period. They conducted themselves on a Keynesian model of economics, using state borrowing and that kind of thing as one of the principal tools of driving the economy forward, and using managed levels of inflation as another of the tools of driving the economy forward. What has happened to Keynesianism is that it's been overtaken by a position very far to the right of it within capitalism, which says that the state should be small, and they only say that the state should be small when they don't need it. When they need it, they're perfectly happy to use it, as happened. So in the European world, 2007, 2008 saw a big crisis that was caused by financial capitalism and the idiocy of that. Their anti-large state approach didn't stop them turning to the capitalist state to rescue their banks and their financial institutions. So we need to be careful when we hear those people making their arguments against Keynes.
okay. So therefore, in terms of Africa, you've said central planning isn't the way forward. So you're thinking, what would be the best way for Africa to move forward in terms of developing itself, and looking inward to itself? Is there a system that exists in Africa that would best suit Africans to follow in terms of their development?
Right. I think it's an important question, but it might also be a premature question. The problem that us Africans are having at the moment is that we do not control Africa, right? And so there are next to no decisions that we can make that are actually in our interest that the West allows us to get away with. You see what they have done to Zimbabwe, right? And that's important. You see what they did to Gaddafi, a problematic figure, but you saw what they did to Gaddafi. So before we get into how we organize Africa, we have to get into how we liberate Africa. Because in the absence of liberation, Africa will not have the tools of African self-management at our disposal. And that is why I have so much difficulty with the oceans of talk at the moment about unifying Africa within this generation. It's a great thought. And then you ask the people who are advocating that, who are saying that that is their program, what are you going to do about neocolonialism? What are you going to do about Africa's external enemy? And they go silent. Yeah? So the task of us Africans now is not to spend our primary time writing models for how Africa should be run after we liberate ourselves. What we've got to concentrate on is recognizing the hole we're in, how we're going to dig ourselves out, and to recognize that in order to dig ourselves out, we've got to get into a kind of revolutionary process and practice that the Chinese managed over between the 1920s and the late 1940s, and that the Cubans managed over a very long period. You've got to be liberated from capitalism, imperialism, from that system of oppression, which controls everything economic in Africa now, that same class of neocolonialists haven't allowed the Chinese to control. And what the Chinese control is minuscule compared with what Britain and America and Germany and France control in Africa. So when we get excited about China, that excitement should be directed at the people who are letting them in, not at them, because they can only come in if they are let in by the enemies of Africa who sit in office within Africa. But us Africans have to know that the main enemy remains the people who have almost total control of our resources, who sit in racist imperialist London, racist imperialist Paris, racist imperial Bonn, and New York, and Washington, and so on.
Okay, just before we move on there, you said a very interesting point. China's under there because they're being let in. But you also said the Europeans are...
Say that again.
China is only in Africa,
yes,
because they have been let in.
Yes.
You know, the leaders have, you know, actively let them in. But you also said how Europe basically still control the vast majority of Africa.
Yes, that's a fact.
So, yeah. So my question then is, do you think Europe is just sitting back and allowing China to come in to a certain extent? Or do you think there's a, how could I put it? There's a place to which China would not be allowed to pass, to say. They would be allowed to develop so much, but if there seem like they're having a significant hold in Africa, then Europe would have something to say or try to step in and try to cause some kind of destabilization. I'm just interested in that, how Europe and China would play out on the continent.
It's a good question. The first thing is that the West cannot stop China from doing any of the things that it is presently doing in in Africa. The only people who could stop that are Africans, the African masses or the African leadership, or a combination of progressive African leadership and the African masses. We are the only people who can stop China doing what it's doing, in exactly the way that the Jamaican government was the only ones who could have stopped China from coming and putting in bogus roads and whatever and taking land in its place. That was a decision taken by us. Now, the United States government or United States capitalist companies might have views about that, but there's nothing that they can do. Now, something is happening. The West is now starting to mobilize against China in exactly the way that in the 20s and 30s they mobilized against Japan. They gave Japan a blight after the war because they needed a fully developed Japan in the fight against Red China, so-called, and in the fight against Russia. So that's why, and the Japanese are clever and able and so on. So all of that. Now, as I say, the West is now beginning a systematic assault on China. You know the stuff about Huawei and whether Huawei's 5G will be allowed within the West. Even the countries, and especially Great Britain, I dropped the great, especially the United Kingdom, is in the process of reversing a decision it took earlier this year or late last year with regard to 5G. And it will end up in exactly the Trumpian position. And the Trumpian position and the increasingly right wing, it's moving more and more to the center position within the West, is that we have to fight China. And they're busy inventing all kinds of pretexts for doing so. China is said to be sitting on Indian land. China is said, right, Hong Kong, what happened there? Last year, some crazy, and I use the word advisedly, young people in Hong Kong opened up a pro-Western, pro-capitalist, pro-American line against two people, two systems, one country, two systems. They used, with the encouragement of Western governments and the Western media, extraordinary violence. I've never seen a police force anywhere more restrained than the Hong Kong police force were last year against those young people. levels of unimaginable destruction that they wrought. And obviously, in those circumstances, the Chinese government is going to make its move. And it has now done so. Nothing has changed in relation to the two countries, one country, two systems, excepting that given the idiotic anti-Chinese, even anti-Hong Kong generation of young people operating in Hong Kong, something had to be done about them, and the Chinese government has worked out what it wishes to do. I don't see that as an argument against China, right? And the other thing that's happening in the world is that us Africans who do a very bad line focusing on our enemies in the West, who don't bother to talk about how much of Africa they own, who don't bother to talk about how much of our resources are controlled in London and Bonn and Paris and New York. But we're perfectly happy to get very hot under the collar about China. Now, I don't say that we should allow China to do terrible things to us. I say additionally that some of the things that China is doing in Africa, in fact, all of them are what us Africans allow them to do. But that if, for example, I saw a terrible video where an isolated Africa, there are a few Africans there, but one of the Africans was being systematically beaten up by Chinese. Yes? And that kind of thing shouldn't happen in any country in the world. It shouldn't happen in China. And the Chinese government has a duty to stop that happening. And organized Africans, you don't even have to be progressive Africans, particularly progressive as an African, to say to the Chinese, we see things that are happening to Africans in China that you must stop at once, otherwise you're going to run into trouble in your dealings with us on the continent. That's all the Africans have to say. We don't have to join in the Western ramp, anti-Chinese ramp, which is rapidly developing.
Okay. All right. That's brilliant. So I think we'll get back to the book where this come.
Yes.
Just before we go to that, there's a comment here by was it Shakara Speaks, and he said, "Tender well agreed to Elder Cecil." He said he's been looking for the book ever since it came out, but he's not sure if it's available here. How can he get hold of a copy?
It is emphatically not available here. I'm sure that everybody who comes on, I know. So I do know young Shakara. Hi, Shakara, how are you? Yeah, but ever since the book came out, Prof. Prah is looking for a publisher somewhere in the West, in the UK or the US. And in fact, he's asked me to help him look for such a publisher. So I'm in the process of doing that, although I think that the book would benefit from a rewriting. But brother Shakara, the publishers are African Century Editions, and you will know how to get in touch with Prof. Prah, and he will tell you how to get his book. Okay. But none of them are available here at the moment.
Oh, all right. And another quick comment from Shakara is asking the name of the lecturer and lecturers that enlightened us about 1963.
Okay, brother, we're going to, I don't have that in my head, although I have the lecture on my computer. Either me, if Brother Taharkah can't do that now, we promise to do that, to give that information out on this channel sometime soon. And the lecture can be accessed.
Because I've got to look it up.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'll just have to look it up.
But it's not
okay.
A problem. We'll supply that information.
Yeah. During your review, you mentioned the publication "The Black Man" and how pivotal and important it was. Could you just give us a bit of background on that publication?
Okay. Have it in my hands. Expensive book, more than £100 it costs. This is it, right? Garvey's Black Man. Robert Hill collected them up and put it out as long ago as 1975. So it's been available a long time. Okay? Now, the first edition, or the first bit of it, which is not in this publication, actually came out in Jamaica, maybe in about 1931. And the rest of it appears in the United Kingdom after Garvey came to live in the UK in 1935. Yeah, so it's an extraordinary thing. It's collected and edited and introduced by Professor Robert Hill. I don't like his intro, but that's neither here nor there. And how can I describe it? Garvey deals in the pages of the Black Man over all of those years with all kinds of then current issues. All kinds of people publish in it. You see, that's what an edition of it would have looked like, and that's what Hill has gathered up, and it runs to hundreds of pages. Amongst the things that happened in it, that, for example, dramatic, is that when His Imperial Majesty left Ethiopia in 1936, if my memory serving me right, when the Italians invaded, Garvey had been supportive of the Ethiopians and of His Imperial Majesty up until that point. But if you look through the pages of this book, you find that there comes a time when there's a headline that says, "War in Ethiopia, the Emperor runs." And after that, Garvey is systematically condemnatory of His Imperial Majesty. So some Rastafari who know two things about Garvey. One is that in Jamaica, as Rastafari, as a movement began to emerge there, he came out against the movement. He was probably by then already a Methodist, and he didn't like the idea of anybody saying that His Imperial Majesty was divine. So he condemns Rastafari in the pages of the Gleaner in the early years of the emergence of Rastafari in Jamaica. And then later in the 30s, when he's living here, he has a running battle. His Imperial Majesty doesn't hit back, not at least in the pages of the Black Man, but there is systematic condemnation of His Majesty for not staying in Ethiopia and fighting. And he talks, the Black Man talks about slavery persisting in Ethiopia under His Imperial Majesty and so on. So it's very wide-ranging. Whole heap of different people turn up in its pages, and it's well worth, right? I found it. January 1937. Okay. War in Ethiopia, the Emperor runs, is what it says on this page. And it's the volume 2, number 5, January 1937 of the Black Man.
Yeah.
If somebody wants to actually check it, what you have to do is go to your reference library and request it. There's something called the interlibrary loan, and almost any municipal library will get it for you. They won't let you borrow it, but they will get it and you can read it there. People don't know about interlibrary loan, but generally, if you want a book, it's available in a library somewhere, and there's a system whereby your local library will borrow it for you, but they won't lend it to you.
But that particular book is still on sale. The Hill volume.
To be honest, I don't know whether it's still available. It came out in 1975, so it may now be out of print. But again, all anybody has to do who wants a book like this, if you have money to spend, you Google, and then you put in the Black Man, Marcus Garvey, edited Robert Hill, and see what comes up. One might be available relatively cheaply. I don't know. I haven't looked recently because I have mine.
Okay, right. Yeah, and it's a good point you make, because you made the point about Selassie leaving Ethiopia during the war.
Yeah.
I mean, recently, just just a bit of a side. Recently, I think a statue of him was badly damaged down in a park in Wimbledon, because apparently Wimbledon was where he stopped during that time.
No,
so it's
he
just
might have passed through Wimbledon, but most of the time he lived not in Wimbledon, but in Bath. And there's a house there that he used to live in, which is still a kind of a shrine. It was handed over to the city of Bath. I think it's Bath. I've never been there myself. And there's occasionally trips down there and so on. And Rastafari have from time to time tried to raise money to fix up the place and do things there. So it's ongoing. So that he stopped in London, but he lived primarily down there. And then for the rest of that story, you know that once, when the Italians invaded Ethiopia in 36, Britain and the rest of the world did nothing. But when Italy joined the Second World War with Germany, Italy became the enemy of Britain. And at that point, Britain joined with the Ethiopians to throw the Italians out of Ethiopia. And in the end, His Imperial Majesty, at the head of a combination of British and Ethiopian forces, rode triumphantly back into Addis Ababa long before the end of the Second World War.
Okay. I'm just looking some more comments are coming in. Okay. Well, Cecil takes a quick break.
Just to complete that story, I have in my hand a book. I don't know if the thing can pick it up. It's the Abyssinian Campaign, and it's actually the British official account of the military operation that led to the liberation of Ethiopia from Italian conquerors during the Second World War, way before the end of the war. Again, you won't be able to get it in any bookshop, but it's a key text on how His Imperial Majesty got back to Ethiopia and under what circumstances.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, there's a few points I've got to bring up, but I'll just take some more of the points of question that come in. There's one here from
my same former student and friend. No, I don't know Nigel Stewart.
Was it Nigel Stewart? I don't quite understand the limitation of central planning. He said, could you please explain?
All right.
Explain a bit more about
it. The easy way to approach that is to remember that the Soviet Union fell apart, is no longer there. We have Russia, but Russia is much smaller than what the Soviet Union was. And that was the main example in the world of an economy being run on the basis of central planning. And the argument, although there's much more to it than that, is that central planning in that particular and important instance failed in all crucial respects, and it ended up being abolished. It imploded. So if you want an instance of the limitations and failure of central planning as a system, all you have to do is say the Soviet Union and the failure of the Soviet Union. As against that, it matters that they did manage to put men into space. They did manage an advanced economy. They managed all kinds of things. They managed nuclear engineering and so on. So using central planning with elements of the market to supplement it, including a moment in the 1920s when, under something called New Economic Planning or New Economic Policy, they went back entirely to the market in order to solve some temporary problems that they were having. So I don't wish to try to say more than that. I just say to the brother who asked the question that look at the Soviet Union, and then look at the extent to which China is not using central planning as its only mechanism for running that economy.
Okay. There's another point here from Brother Mon. Brother Mon here. And they said, what are the first steps that revolutionary Pan-Africanism should take to liberate Africa in the 21st century?
Now, that is the $1 million question, and I knew exactly what, I wish I knew exactly what to do. But the first thing is to understand the big word, existential need for it. Because in the absence of a revolution like the one that happened in China, or even if not like the one in China, but with the outcome that was achieved in China, i.e. liberating Africa from the control of its main enemy, which is Western white terrorist imperialism, capitalism. That system is Africa's main enemy. The Chinese liberated themselves from that between 1920s and 1948, when the last vestige of the Chinese that represented that were thrown out of mainland China. Now, so it's something with that outcome that is required. It's clearly not easy. Some of it has to be clandestine, but importantly, the first thing for serious Africans to realize is that without that, we are a doomed race, because nothing is happening in Africa at the moment that is pointing in any other direction. I hear people talking about the miracle of which country is it? Where
Rwanda, must be Rwanda.
Yeah, the miracle of Rwanda. There is no miracle.
Yeah,
there's no miracle in Rwanda. There was talk about the miracle in Ethiopia, and for a moment it looked as if things had eased up there. They had a Moro president and so on. The people are back on the street. The Moro are up in arms because of stuff that's happening to them. But crucially, all of the 46 states of 56 or 54, whatever number of states of Africa, are effectively under the control of the enemy. And that means that the task of liberation has to start now, and it has to start where each of us African is, and we have to be prepared to do what is necessary to try to achieve that objective. And they kill people.
Yeah, okay. All right. There's another point here by Brother Shakara, and that's referring to the black man. He said the volume is not really in print, but you can get a copy here and there for around £200.
Yes, that's true. Yes, that's what I thought.
Just some information.
I bought mine.
Okay.
I bought mine for about £100 a long time ago.
Okay. And Brother Shakara again, he wants to know, what is it? He's asking if you have read Baba Chinwezi's appraisal of Papa Garvey.
You've got me there, young Shakara, because I can't pretend. I got the highest regard for Elder Chinwezu. I know he's doing some stuff on Pan-Africanism. I haven't caught up with him, and I haven't seen his assessment of Garvey. So no is the short answer, and I can't help you on that. But if you send me a link to that, especially if it's online, I'd be happy to look at it and get back to you about it.
All right. Yeah, during your review, you brought up two very important names. First, you brought up Baba Tony Martin and the publication Race First.
Yes.
And then you also talked about Du Bois, W.E.D. Du Bois. and his relationship with Garvey. Could you just expand on those a little bit for me, please?
Okay. Tony Martin was a Caribbean scholar, a scholar from Trinidad who came up here with scholarly credentials. He got his PhD, which is what his which is what Race First is, from a UK university. He also qualified as a barrister at law, and then he went to teach in the United States at forget the name of the university there. But Tony Martin was an extremely serious scholar and an extremely serious Garveyite scholar. So he was reissuing all of Garvey's work, but crucially, his if you were going to read one book on Garvey, and it wasn't Garvey's The Philosophy and Opinion of Marcus Garvey, the book that I would recommend that people work with and on is Tony Martin's Race First, because it deals with each aspect of Garvey, including his relationship with communism, one chapter after another, and the whole story is there, including the problems of the shipping line, the two shipping lines, and including the problem of how and why his Liberian adventure failed. Not because of any inefficiency. African people were pouring money into the Liberia project. It's the Americo-Liberians, i.e. the African ex-enslaved people who had set up Liberia in the 1820s against the interest of the Africans who were already living there. Those people were both the enemies of Garvey and against the indigenous Africans. And Tony Martin deals with all of that and more. So I repeat, a single book on Garvey, there's a paperback of it, not all that expensive, but it's a very important place to start with regard to Garvey. Now, who did you ask about?
Also asked about the boys, but just before I go there, I'd just like to say, yes, a single book, but I was also, if you read Race First, you should also read the Pan-African Connection by Tony Martin, because those two books, Race First and the Pan-African Connection,
yes,
seem to go well together.
I couldn't agree with you more.
Yes,
another good book on Garvey is a collection by John Heinrich Clarke, Marcus Garvey and the Vision of Africa. That one by John Heinrich Clarke. And again, it's almost certainly available as a paperback, so it's affordable broadly. Yeah?
Yeah, the other person I mentioned was Du Bois, Dr. E. Du Bois. I mean, know him and Garvey had an up and down relationship.
I'm coming to Du Bois, and precisely because I'm in my study and can reach my shelves and remain in the conversation, I have in my hand one of two volumes on W.E.B. Du Bois that were assembled, edited, if you will, and introduced by Julius Lester. It's called The Seventh Son, and there are two volumes of it. Du Bois didn't like Garvey. He didn't like him because he was a shadist. Garvey was too black. And so we have our defects, all right? So there was that. But he didn't like Garvey's class politics, and he didn't like the fact, and many African Americans didn't, that Garvey had relations with the Ku Klux Klan. So some African Americans had issues with Garvey, even while Garvey was the biggest figure in African America by far for all of the years that he was there, actually bigger than Du Bois, objectively, right? Now, Du Bois is a very bright and able man and scholar, and it matters, therefore, that if he wrote anything about Garvey, it will be worth reading. And he has two papers. They're not impossible to read long, but they are in these volumes, and people should get hold of them and read them, right? Du Bois on Garvey in The Seventh Son. It may be difficult to get hold of it. I don't think they're in print at the moment. So the way to get it is to keep looking it up on a book and on Amazon. And when they come up, save up your money and you'll be able to afford it. Books that have gone out of print can be actually quite expensive on the net. Okay, so that's what I recommend. Importantly, though, some Garveyites get very hot on the collar about Du Bois. I'm not amongst the people who do that. I think that you have to understand where he was coming from, who he is, the fact that the UNIA couldn't possibly have accommodated W.E.B. Du Bois. It matters that Du Bois, even though he was a communist, might have had a disturbing relationship with the United States government. I'll say no more than that for the moment. So there's a problem about how he was relating to the US government, and some people could say that he was a spy for them. So there's problems with this man. The other thing to know is that the second Mrs. Garvey, Amy Jakes Garvey, actually was in correspondence with W.E.B. Du Bois, and they related reasonably comfortably and had, right? So that too matters. So the second Mrs. Garvey didn't have any problem with relating to W.E.B. Du Bois. But importantly, read what he wrote about Garvey, and they're not unfair, right? And they're actually informative. It's a serious, the two essays are serious assessments from left, orthodox, African-American, elitist position of Marcus Garvey's years in the United States of America. The Seventh Son, Volume 1 and 2, Julius Lester.
Okay. And now, coming on to the 1945 Pan-African Congress held here in Manchester.
Yes.
You refer to it as a Garveyite Congress. Could you just expand why you did that?
That's a little bit of a trick, but I'm perfectly prepared to defend it. The point I'm making is that up until that time, if you look at Pan-Africanism, you will see a whole lot of gradualism. People talking about ameliorating the conditions under which people in the colonies live. People beginning to talk about dominion status. As a child, I was hearing that in Jamaica. This is long afterwards. So what the key point I'm making is that the moment Garvey sets up the UNIA in 1914 in Jamaica, he's already talking about a liberated and unified Africa. He's already talking about the white people to leave now and not in 200 years' time. So Garvey's revolutionary Pan-Africanism was directed towards getting colonialism out of Africa on a short time scale. And that's nothing along those lines of any substance appears in Pan-Africanism until 1945, when everybody is saying what Garvey had been saying for years, namely, the white people must come out of Africa now. And that's what the program of the Fifth Pan-African Congress was. Let us go and get the white people out of Africa. So in that sense, it was Pan-Africanism adopting Garveyite, uncompromising anti-colonialism.
Right. So regarding the Fifth Pan-African Congress, you also mentioned one of the leading personalities was Nkrumah.
Yes.
Could you also mention some of the others? Because I know apart from Nkrumah, there was quite a few giants there who went on to do great things.
Du Bois was there. I think Nyerere was there. Nkrumah was there. Padmore was there. It's a long list, you know. And for those who don't know, our brother Hakim Adi, who's a really expert man on the history of Pan-Africanism, has a history of Pan-Africanism here, which has enough of what I've been talking about. His perspective is different from mine. In his book on entitled Pan-Africanism: A History, Bloomsbury Press. It only came out last year. It's definitely available, right? 2018, 2 years ago, right? But importantly, he and a white woman called Marika Sherwood has a book out there which identifies and locates everybody who was at the fifth Pan-African Congress in Manchester. So not this book, but another one where Hakim and Marika are the joint authors. And everything that you want to know, well, much of what you want to know, but not from my perspective, on the Fifth Pan-African Congress is actually in that book by Marika and Hakim.
Okay, there's another question here,
yes,
and that's from was it Sister Janie Jem, and she's asking about Du Bois, the relationship with him and Kwame Nkrumah. She said, given that Nkrumah was of a dark complexion, and given that Du Bois eventually retired in Ghana in his latter years because of his realization that he would always be an, I suppose that would be an African.
No, it's a good question. Yeah, it's a good question, but it misunderstands what I was saying. I'm saying, and it's in Du Bois' work, you know, that he comments on Garvey's physical appearance. So I'm not inventing that. That is not, and I'm not saying, therefore, that Du Bois was against all black-skinned people. He was a serious Pan-Africanist, and he did go and live. He ended his days in Ghana. That is undoubtedly the case. So, importantly, all I was saying at that point is that one of the things, negative comments that that Du Bois makes about Garvey is Garvey's physical appearance. Yeah, because even though he's a complex and rich figure, Du Bois, he was also a shadist, and shadism is present amongst us. Yeah, that is to say, high color, good hair, all of that foolishness, right? And it's present at all levels of our society, including the tendency of darker skinned men to marry lighter skinned women and all of that stuff, which can be discussed. You know, look at most couples and you'll see it.
Okay, and yeah, just before we move on, there's around that point as well. Who's it? Brother Shakara's put another one. He said he just highlighting the relationship between Du Bois and Padmore, which is also very fundamental.
Well, I can't see the Padmore one, but he's right here. He's talking about the relationship. That's Firestone. Firestone, and he's right. Firestone, and he's right.
I got Padmore in my mind to say Padmore was one of those around at the fifth Pan-African.
Right, no, I can see this, so I know that it says Firestone. And again,
it's Firestone.
Brother Shakara is right. Du Bois was compromised, seriously compromised in relation to the American government and Firestone, which was their agent, along with the Afro-Liberians in Liberia. And that combination of forces was absolutely backward. It was anti-Garvey. That's why Garvey never, Garvey spent a whole heap of money, sent a whole heap of stuff to Liberia that was just ripped off by the reactionary Liberian, Americo-Liberian people. And Firestone is a fundamental part of that. And they didn't want Garvey there. Du Bois, even though he made proposals after Garvey about settlement in Liberia, never came to anything.
Yeah,
But
and
he's a
what was on my mind?
yeah.
Yeah, carry
Go
on.
on. No, please.
Okay. No, no, I said what was on my mind as well was Padmore. That's why it came out. That Padmore was also instrumental in the Fifth Pan African Congress.
Yes.
And now, what I want to ask in terms of Padmore, did he have much relationship with Garvey? Was there any
No.
anything there?
No.
Padmore and also CLR James. What were their relation with Garvey?
Right.
Or was there any?
People who were in those days seriously Marxist had real difficulty with Garvey, who presented as an anti-Marxist, not because he was necessarily against Marxism objectively, but because he was against the attempts of Marxists to undermine and infiltrate and overthrow him. And he was very hot on defense of his organization, his values, and of his own place in it. So he had difficulty with all kinds of Marxists. The W.A. Domingo, who was for a time, was actually the first editor of his popular newspaper, Negro World. He had problems with the If We Must Die brother, the poet and novelist. What's his name? If We Must
Claude
Die.
McKay?
Claude McKay.
Langston Hughes. Claude McKay, yeah.
No. Claude McKay, who was also in the UNIA for a while. So lots of Marxists and communists passed through and left because they couldn't capture the organization, couldn't displace Garvey, or they didn't like everything that was happening in the organization. So it's a complicated history, and there's a good chapter on that's relevant to this in Race First.
Okay, and carrying on. You never mentioned him by name, but it was Ramsay MacDonald that came about with the phrase "the wind of change."
No, not Ramsay MacDonald. It's Harold Macmillan.
Harold Macmillan.
Yes, Tory Prime
Harold
Minister
Macmillan.
in
That's
the early 1960s.
Harold Macmillan.
Yes.
And then they talk about, then came flag independence and how Europe made a stand to say where the large amount of the people settled,
resources, strategy,
their feet. Yeah, that's right. It was going to drag their feet in terms of settling anything. And then out of that came what we saw happening in especially the Francophone part, especially Algeria. Could you just give us a little background on Algeria and the role that, say, Frantz Fanon played in that conflict?
Okay, good point. Fanon is from the French Caribbean, very bright man, who went as something like a 16-year-old into the French army, got sent. He joined the army because at the moment that when France was conquered by the Germans in 1939, yeah, and he stowed away from the island that he came from, Martinique, I believe, and ended up, which is what he intended to do in the French army, was sent to North Africa, fought heroically there, and actually has France's highest military honor. Yeah, so, and then he goes and finishes his education, studies medicine, and then studies psychiatry, and the French send him as a psychiatrist to a hospital, big hospital in Algeria. And while he's there, he's already a radical, he's a war hero, all kind of stuff. A war hero, but he's seriously interested in Black psychology and the psychology of the oppressed. And he effectively discovers that French colonialism in Algeria is driving the Algerians mad. He said almost literally, he calls it the Arab condition. And he observes, and then while he's there, the Algerian population, the non-European bit of it, decide that they want their independence. The French say, Algiers is France, we're not going anywhere. The colons belong there. This is France. and a most brutal civil war starts, which the Algerians win. And Fanon was a very important figure in that war as a combatant in it. The French probably poisoned him. He may not have died of that. Leukemia might have been induced by them. I believe so. But let's leave that to one side. He then was widely respected throughout Africa. He was at those two conferences that Nkrumah organized for liberation forces in Accra in 1958. And everybody knows that he wrote The Wretched of the Earth, that he wrote Black Skin, White Mask, that he has two collections of essays called A Dying Colonialism and what's the other one name? Yeah. Towards the African Revolution, which is the argument that I'm making today. Without the revolutionary Pan-Africanist revolution in Africa, by us Africans, we're finished. So Fanon studies in A Dying Colonialism, The Wretched of the Earth, Towards the African Revolution, and Black Skin, White Mask. He wrote a great deal and is seriously analyzed. There's big fat biographies of him like that and so on. He's very, very well documented and important man. And the French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre, who was a communist and a serious Marxist philosopher, writes the introduction to The Wretched of the Earth in this edition of it. So
okay,
Fanon is an African Caribbean revolutionary. Yes, brother.
Very important. Yeah, and the other point is you mentioned about, well, we just dwell on the Francophone and the tactics that they were using. And then in terms of the Anglophone side now, the British made a stand, as we know, in Kenya and Zimbabwe, what was then Rhodesia and so forth.
Yes.
Now, the point that you mentioned is that very important point, that they have just finished the Nuremberg trials, which people were hanged for putting up concentration camp and killing people. And then the British went into Africa and did exactly the same thing in terms of the Mau Mau rebellion in Kenya. And you also mentioned the fact that
keep talking.
Britain actually came up with the concept of concentration camp way before that.
Not just the concept, the practice in South Africa when they were fighting.
The practice
when they're fighting
and,
the bull.
So I'd just like you to expand a bit more on that. I know that the German also had a hand in that kind of way with the Auroras in what's now Namibia.
Yes.
Going back, setting up the same kind of system.
Right. Okay. We have to separate the genocides at the start of the 20th century that involved Europeans from all European countries. What the Germans did in Namibia, Southwest Africa, is similar to what the Belgians did in the Congo, is similar to what the British did in establishing their state in Kenya, is similar to what the British did under Rhodes in establishing their double state, the Rhodesias in the middle of South Central Africa. So early 20th century genocides by Europeans is par for the course. And some of the people who carried out those genocides, especially the Germans, went back to Germany and played a part in the genocide that Hitler organized against the Jews and other people that they didn't like. Now, nobody stopped Hitler in his anti-Jewish crusade to come to power inside of Germany. And then he started a war, and at that point they had to defeat him. At the end of the war, the British and the French and the Russians and the Americans tried German Nazis for war crimes, including what they'd done to people in concentration camps. Okay? And then, so they occupy this position of moral high ground. We're superior to those nasty Germans, and we're going to punish them. We're going to make sure that nothing like that happens again. And lo and behold, in Algeria, the French used Nazi methods against Algerian liberation fighters, and the British find that in the early 50s, Africans who they'd pushed off their land, especially the Kikuyu, but by no means the Kikuyu alone, wanted their land back. And they started something called the Kenya Land and Freedom Army, which is about land and freedom in Kenya. The British dubbed them Mau Mau, declared them to the most primitive barbaric people on God's earth, and set up a state of emergency. And in order to win, there's the most important book on that subject is this one, Britain's Gulag, by a white American scholar called Carolyn Elkin, right? And what she shows is that the British in Kenya between about 1952 and 1954 put into concentration camps almost the whole of the Kikuyu population, more than 1 million people, and caused the deaths of untold, nobody counted, numbers of them. And this is within less than 10 years of them hanging Nazis for exactly the same kind of thing. Yeah, so that's the point that I was making. And then those same people, the British and the Dutch, Boers in South Africa, wanted to hold on to that territory, to South Africa. And the stuff that they did internally and externally, what they did externally is called destructive engagement. The West gave South Africa nuclear bombs, just as they gave Israel nuclear bombs. Same reason, racist states. Yeah? And so they gave them nuclear weapons, and they gave them carte blanche to mash up the surrounding countries, to kill, to send letter bombs, to bomb, to attack bases, right? So systematic destruction in the frontline states, so-called, yeah? And millions of Africans were killed in that process. So we Africans need to know that that was so. One more very important point to make. You see, Nelson Mandela, maybe I make this too often, I don't know, but Nelson Mandela was amongst the first ANC leaders to understand that the whites were not going to surrender power and that they had to be fought in order to give it up. And so he committed to armed struggle from very early. But it's very important that we understand that you can be in favor of armed struggle and not be a revolutionary. And all Nelson Mandela actually wanted was for Africans to have South Africa to have one person, one vote. He didn't want the economy revolutionized. He didn't want Africans to own everything. He got no particular policy on the land, nothing. Very different from Winnie, who had a much more advanced revolutionary position on what was to happen after white power was defeated. So just being committed to armed struggle doesn't make you a revolutionary. Not if revolutionary means reorganizing the society, putting the wealth into the hands of the poor people and all of that. So Nelson wasn't a revolutionary.
Well, just just to add to that, if you mention Mandela, I suppose I have to mention Robert Sobukwe, who
Yes,
came out around that time and ended up setting up the Pan-Africanist Congress of Tanzania,
yes,
and I would say, was of a very, very different mindset.
yes.
So I would say in
I
the
Yeah.
last 10 minutes, we've about 10 minutes left. So one of the things I like to, you also mentioned in your presentation about neocolonialism,
Yes,
and you actually use the term, I wrote it down here, where is it? Anyway, you mentioned roughly about what the Australians are doing, some Australian mining company, and
yes.
how they're
In
being
South Africa,
assisted.
on the
Yeah, and
eastern.
how they've been assisted by certain forces in South Africa
Yes,
to
it's
get
not
away
certain
with
forces. It's the
murder.
ANC government. Yes,
Jeez.
it's not. There's nothing
Yeah, could you
obscure
just
about.
expand on that? Because yeah, because it's the first time I've come across that. So could you just say a
Okay,
little bit more about
let's
that?
be clear. Let's be clear. It's the ANC government, along with Lonmin, that shot down all of those people in 2012. The man who is now state president of South Africa and president of the ANC, what's his name?
Ramaphosa.
Cyril Ramaphosa.
Yeah.
Cyril Ramaphosa is a billionaire. Was a leading shareholder in Lonmin, and he was fully a party to the plan, helped with drawing up the plan to fire on those people, the miners, in 2012, 16th of October, of August in 2012, and to kill all of those people. Was it the 12th or the 16th? My memory is not what it was. Yeah. So that's who we're dealing with. This is the ANC. Cyril Ramaphosa's ANC is an entity that's prepared to kill Africans for white Western imperialist companies. We don't have to guess that anymore because of what happened on television at Maracana. Now, other things are happening in South Africa, and unless you have links with the groups down there, don't get into the Western press. But so what I'm talking about is the fact that there's a place called Amadibaland, which is on the southeast side of South Africa. They have some shale sand that has a valuable mineral in it. And there are two approaches to that. The location is wonderfully beautiful. I've not been there, but I believe it to be, because that's what the people say. And they want to keep it in its pristine condition and enjoy it as nature reserves and this kind of thing. And there's another attitude which says, mine the sand, mash it up, and you will benefit from the jobs that you get or whatever. The majority of the people in the area, this is a fact, are not in favor of the mining option because they know the price and they don't want their land destroyed, right? It's not as if this doesn't happen, Look at what has happened in the Niger Delta as a consequence of Shell taking oil out of there and not paying any attention to the environment. What is about to happen in Guyana is that sludge and natural gas will pollute the whole of that environment. And the Guyanese government has signed up to it, and people believe that Guyana is going to become rich. So back to Zolobeni. The people who are proposing this mining development, ruining the environment, are an Australian company. And they have found allies in the government of South Africa, the ANC. And they are buying up and creating allies amongst the people of Amadibaland, who they hope in time will enable them to say that there is support amongst the people for what we're trying to do. And in the meantime, they are busy killing the leadership of the opposition to this development, even though the opposition to development keeps winning court cases because what the government is doing is contrary to provisions in the South African Constitution and contrary to other points in law. Right? We Africans, it's very difficult to know about these things, but we Africans have to know what these bogus leaderships that are in the pockets of Western companies and Western imperialism are actually doing in real places. If you were to get hold of, and they send it to me all the time, I don't know how they got onto their list, a squatters movement in South Africa, and day in, day out, they supply information about what the ANC, the local government, which is ANC, is doing to them. Terrible things, including killings.
Okay. Consider the time. So there's two more points or questions I would take. There's one here from Shakara, and then what I wanted to do to end, there's something that came out recently, a few days ago. Was it his name Starkey, from ex-Cambridge University historian? I don't know if you came across a comment that he made recently.
What did he say? Starkey, right, is a well-known reactionary white man who came out in. So no, I'd just like to end on that because I like to say what the statement was and for your comment on it. Please go on, because I didn't read
just before we go there. Yeah, but just before we go there, I'd just like to put up Shakara's comment, and he'd say, could you just give a brief little appraisal of Hakimadi's book, because you mentioned it briefly. New book is just brought out.
Right. Okay. As it happens, I spent time on their book on the 5th Pan-African Congress, but I haven't yet completely read the book on Pan-Africanism and don't want to comment. I've heard Hakim present on it, and I know the line he takes in relation to these matters, but I mustn't pretend to have read anything like all of his book on Pan-Africanism, the one I just held up. But he's a fine scholar, he's an honest man, and so factually his book will be sound. That I do say.
Okay. Well, just to bring this program this week to an end, and as usual, you've done a brilliant. I noticed the numbers have stayed with us today, and you've done a brilliant, brilliant job, Elder Cecil. And it's just to say what Starkey came out with. I think he was on a program being interviewed, and the thing about slavery came up.
Yes.
And for some reason, he then brought up the fact that slavery cannot be compared to the Holocaust. And then the point that was highlighted, because he said too much of those damn Africans survived. So if so much of us survived, how he did. You should look it up, and it was on the front page of the Metro newspaper, bold. I'm surprised because it was Brother Kwame that sent it to me, so I'm surprised he didn't get a copy.
No, I usually, on
the front page.
It depends on which morning.
Right on the front page.
It was probably Friday morning. Yeah. Was it day
right
before
on the
yesterday?
Front page of, well, I think it happened either Thursday morning or something like that, Wednesday or Thursday.
Yes.
But as a result of that, he's had to resign from some trust he was involved with the Mary Rose. His Cambridge University, he's had to resign from some fellowship he had with them. And it really backfired on him. So it's a pity that you haven't read it yet, but you know, considering what I just said, he said, I mean, what's your comment on that? And it's most likely somebody that you are familiar with.
Right. I've never read Starkey's work because there's some kinds of historians that I don't bother to read, but I do know his name, right? And I know that after the 2011 uprising around the murder of Duggan, he said some stuff
yes.
about
I think it was
feral.
white youth becoming black or something.
Yes, yeah. So he said outrageous things in the past, and he's definitely a racist right winger. So, but if he overstepped the bounds even for white folk, that's very good, because the more they're not on the media saying this horrible stuff, the better. So if they delegitimate themselves, that's all to the good. I noticed that the man who's Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, even after the Oxford College that has roads up on the front of it decided to take it down, that Boris Johnson, who is a known and deliberate racist, still managed to make a statement opposing the taking down of the Rhodes statue. And we just need to remember that this is a man who, remember the white racist who made an effigy of Grenfell and circulated it mocking. Right? Mm-hmm. Part of that man's defense was that Boris Johnson had said worse racist things than him and hadn't been charged. And so he couldn't see why this mocking thing that was never meant to be way out there, and Johnson's things were always so popular in newspapers, why he should be charged and convicted and Boris Johnson not. And in fact, the man got off.
Okay. Right. Yeah. Okay. So again, fortunately, we have come to the end of this session. But again, very enjoyable. I mean, I think Professor Prah really got you wiped up and started you off, which is a good thing. It's a good thing because it led to a good debate, and we touched upon some really, really crucial things. And just to say, you mentioned quite a few books there, quite a few books. And I'd just like to remind everybody that a lot of those books can be got from Pepukayi Books. And Pepukayi Books is based at 366A High Road, Tottenham. So I will put it in the description below, the contact for it, just in case anybody would like to pursue some of those books, and they can always check out Pepukayi. Always check Pepukayi before you go to Amazon.
My brother, I want to say something else in connection with Head Start and Pepukayi Books. You know that right now the municipality, the mayor of London, is doing a campaign around London is open, and they circulated something saying they want people to participate in it. So this Saturday, not inside but outside on the frontage of 366A High Road, Tottenham, there'll be a book exhibition and another kind of exhibition. The overall theme will be Black Lives Matter, but we'll put the Garvey books that we mentioned today, but the main focus is on children's books, and there'll be a display of the way that relates to the way in which Black lives have not mattered in Britain, as the state has killed more and more of us, going back to David Olawale and even the brother Charles, what's his name in Liverpool, who they killed in 1919 or 1920, Charles Wotton. Yeah. So please, people can come. I think let's say we'll start at 12:01. Especially if you want children's books, come and see, and also come and see our display, which I'm going to try to put together between now and then, on why Black Lives Matter here as well as in the United States, in the face of a police force, especially the Met and West Midlands police, that have been killing us for decades.
Okay, so remember that's this Saturday, as I said.
This Saturday afternoon.
This Saturday at 366A High Road, Tottenham. That's where Pepukayi Books is based, and they'll be doing an exhibition. So, has any flyers been done or anything like that?
No. We got the stuff about Friday, and we've responded.
Okay,
the event will definitely happen. Yeah. They haven't offered any help, but we're seeking help at least for covering. and the exhibition is going to be out
Right.
there, unless it's raining.
Oh, brilliant. Yeah, brilliant. So that's something to look forward to. Definitely, definitely. And remember, the month of August is Garvey's month. So on this channel, we will be looking to do a few presentations, particularly based on Garvey and his works, to expand on just how insightful and brilliant and overwhelming Garvey was in his work, and why his influence is still prevalent, still prevailing right today more than anybody else, I would say, right on the African continent. You go there, you mention the name Garvey, and Garvey now is a household name, which is good to see. So again, I'd like to thank everybody for tuning into PSM TV, and we will be back again next week with a very interesting presentation for you. So again, I'd like to thank Elder Cecil, and remember, he'll be back again on the first Sunday in August. Every first Sunday, something to look forward to. So the first Sunday in August, we'll be welcoming back again. So until next week, I thank everybody for listening to us, and I thank everybody for tuning in. And remember, like I said, if you're new to this channel, please just like it, because just by liking it, you're helping to promote the channel, which is something that we definitely would like you to help us with. So until next week, I bid everybody kwaheri and good luck until we see you again next week. So bye.